The debate between Noam Chomsky and William F. Buckley Jr. on the Vietnam War was a heated and contentious affair, but Chomsky ultimately emerged as the victor. Buckley tried to defend the U.S. intervention in Vietnam as necessary to prevent the spread of communism, but Chomsky was able to convincingly demonstrate that the war was fundamentally unjust and immoral. Chomsky began by defining imperialism as the use of power to control the resources and labor of another country for the benefit of the imperial power. He then went on to argue that the US was acting imperialistically in Vietnam, by propping up a corrupt and unpopular government and by bombing and killing innocent civilians. Buckley countered that the US was not acting imperialistically in Vietnam, but was instead defending the country from communist aggression. He also argued that the US was not targeting civilians, but was only bombing military targets. However, Chomsky was able to refute Buckley's arguments point by point. He showed that the US had no legitimate interest in Vietnam, and that the war was actually motivated by a desire to control the country's resources and labor. He also showed that the US was deliberately targeting civilians, and that the war had caused immense suffering and death. In the end, Buckley was left speechless. He had no answer to Chomsky's arguments, and he was forced to admit that the US was wrong to intervene in Vietnam. The debate was a clear victory for Chomsky, and it helped to solidify his reputation as one of the leading critics of US foreign policy. Here are some of the key points made by Chomsky during the debate that helped him win the debate. Chomsky showed that the US had no legitimate interest in Vietnam. The country was not a threat to the US, and it had no resources that the US needed. Chomsky showed that the war was actually motivated by a desire to control Vietnam's resources and labor. The US had been propping up a corrupt and unpopular government in Vietnam for years, and it was now using the war as an excuse to expand its control over the country. Chomsky showed that the US was deliberately targeting civilians. The US was using indiscriminate bombing and artillery fire, and it was clear that the goal was to kill as many Vietnamese people as possible. Chomsky showed that the war had caused immense suffering and death. Millions of Vietnamese people had been killed or wounded, and millions more had been displaced from their homes. In conclusion, Chomsky won the debate with Buckley because he was able to convincingly demonstrate that the US was wrong to intervene in Vietnam. He showed that the war was motivated by imperialism and greed, and that it had caused immense suffering and death. Buckley was unable to refute Chomsky's arguments, and he was forced to admit that the US was wrong.